Mary.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Could you imagine meeting your Lama and devoting your life to the teachings? Venerable Rabina has served her gurus, Lama Yeshe and Lama Rinpoche, since the 1970s. As editorial director of Wisdom Publications, editor of Mandala magazine, executive director of the Liberation Prison Project, Venerable Rabina shares her inspiration and insight to carry us deeper into the teachings, into the path, by her podcasts, teachings, Instagram posts, Facebook posts, compiled and edited books, such as the recent Enjoy Your Life Liberated from Prison. Welcome, Venerable Rabina.
Thank you, dearest Mary. Thank you, precious one. Thank you so much. How happy to be here in Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Lama Yeshe Center. I'm their daughter, so you know. So maybe some of them will filter through me. Let's hope. Okay, darlings, we can start. I think it's really auspicious. We can start with a Mandala offering. So, Mary, you can lead the Mandala offering. Thinking it's the center. You know, Tupta Nobi Ling is invited. So then Tupta Nobi Ling is going to offer on behalf of all of us, the students, a mandala, which is just the universe, all the objects of the universe that make people happy. Pile them all up, and offer this to the Buddha as a request for the teachings, thinking like that.
Thank you. Sam, could you please put it on the first verse? We do 2 verses here. Yeah, we do for 2 verses. Yes, thank you. Sajipu ki jushin me tok tramri rabjing ni degen padi sange jindu mi te uwahi drokunam dagjing la chopar shok. The next verse, please. O holy and perfect pure Lama, from the clouds of compassion that form the skies of your Dharmakaya wisdom, please release a rain of vast and profound Dharma, precisely in accordance with the needs of those to be trained. Idam Guru Ratnam Mandalakam Niryatayami.
So imagine the Buddha very happily received our offering. So now we can sing the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer to start us off. This has got, as I always say, and it's good to remember, 2 parts to it. The first 2 lines, as you can see, are basically saying until we're enlightened, we're going to rely upon the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. That's our commitment. That's assuming that we've committed to being a Buddhist. No one's forcing us. And then the second 2 lines are really expressing our motivation. That's how the Lamas put it. But we just might practically put it, well, what's our purpose? Why are we here together? That's what motivation means. What's the purpose behind what you're doing? And that's pretty crucial point, which we'll discuss. So we're thinking that, you know, we're going to listen to these teachings, and that includes me, I promise, so that we can become a Buddha. That's the long-term goal. It's a long-term goal. As His Holiness says, always aspire to do what's most beneficial. Long-term better than short-term if we can. So that's finally developing our mind to perfection. And why do we do that? Well, first, because it's our potential. It's just how we are. And then our job would be, because there's no longer a separate sense of self, the job would be to be of benefit to others, you know, because of enormous compassion. That's what we're saying. Sangye chadang choke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye drupa shok sangye chadang choke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye drupa shok Sangye charang choke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye drupa shok. Okay, so this is a teaching that Lama Yeshe gave, actually in June 1976, and it happened to be my first teaching. I fell into Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe's lap. In that very first teaching, I had 1 month's lam rim from Lama Zopa, which I didn't have a clue what he's talking about, but I knew there's something here that I had to sit for. Here I am all these years later. And then secondly, Lama Yeshe would come along every now and again and would give a talk in the evenings. You know, I mean, Lama Zopa, this intensive lam rim, I'll never forget it, was in Queensland in Australia, which is like Florida. So because they live in like Florida, they always say the weather's good, but they forget that they get a winter. And so where Chenrezig Institute is, the Chenrezig Institute is the third center in the FPMT, basically. There was Kopan, then there was Tushita in Dharamsala, the retreat center, which is still going. And then the first center outside Asia that the Lamas started was Chenrezig Institute in Queensland, which is, like I said, like Florida, except it's north in Australia because we're upside down, remember? So it's like, you know, just like Florida, super drippy hot in the winter, but I mean, maybe not like Florida, but sometimes quite chilly, because Chenrezig Institute's 100 miles, about 60 miles, 70 miles north of Brisbane, which is the main center there on the coast. And then, but it's up in the highlands a little bit, up a little bit high. And so in the winters, there's just this gales of wind, you know. So this, I mean, never forget this teaching. This Gompa they have was just recently built. They got the center, they offered it to Lama. It was Nick Rebush, who runs Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, his then girlfriend, who's now Yeshe Kadro, who's now in retreat in Queensland, at Chenrezig, in fact, and then two other people, two students at Chenrezig called Tom and Kathy Victor. They were these four hippies who went to Kathmandu, and then they, you know, they were going to grow marijuana, you know, into hippies, into drugs and everything. They were going to grow marijuana in this place, so they decided they'd offer it instead to Lama Zopa and Lama Yeshe. So they accepted, and then it became Chenrezig Institute. Anyway, I remember this teaching. It was the second year, the second course. It was 1976. The first one was 75. They first came to Australia in 74. And I remember the Gompa had just been finished built. And because it is in Queensland, Queensland's got wonderful architecture, which is probably lost now because everyone has AC, where everything's built on stilts, because then the air can come through. They're built very beautifully for that kind of environment, you know, very gorgeous. They call them Queenslanders, this type of architecture, very beautiful houses. And Chenrezig was built a bit like that, was sort of up on stilts. And I remember it wasn't quite finished. And it was because it's cold wind. June is midwinter in Australia. I'll never forget this as long as I live. And there's Gompa's completely packed, 200 people. I sat behind a bloke called Leon. I think he's dead now. And he had this red jacket and it was dirty. I remember I looked for 1 month at the spot of his dirty jacket, like two inches from my nose, because it was quite crowded, you know. And there's Lama Zopa teaching this weird stuff, medieval, arcane. I had no idea what he's talking about. I used to say to myself, where's the Buddhism? Where's the Buddhism? I'd hear occasionally a word, a glimpse of light would come, but I'd have no idea what he was saying, because I didn't understand this packaging, you know. So anyway, but I knew there was something here that I had to sit around for. But this Gompa, you see, in Queensland, the style they have, the architecture, you have lots of what they call, you know, what they call Venetian blinds, you know, those slats, but you have them in glass instead. We call them louver windows. It's the French word, louver. These louver windows, there's lots of those, but the Gompa hadn't got its louver windows in yet. So the whole Gompa is up high and it's got these four sides with these two sides of louver windows, but there were gaping holes, and it's the middle of the winter. But all Queenslanders say, oh, it's hot in Queensland. Well, I tell you, it wasn't. I'll never forget these gales of wind for the entire month. And also coming up your bum from the bottom because the slats of wood, you know. I remember that vividly because I like comfort, so I remember that. And I remember Lama Zopa's words. Then the first month was this Lam Rim course with Lama Zopa. And then occasionally Lama Yeshe would come in the evenings, and I would just sigh with relief. I could not believe. And that was what kept me there, I'm quite sure, you know. Lama kind of made it sound like it was possible, and kind of every word he said made sense. It just seemed like common sense, you know. Thank God, you know, I'd say to myself. I mean, lots of other things too, but it was a pretty intense month for me. Then the second month, I remember I was a feminist at the time, and I'd become out of 6 or 8 years, 10 years in England, 8 years in England of really intensive radical left feminist political activity. I mean, super intensive. So moving from that into a spiritual environment was quite a shock. I was moving towards a spiritual environment again. I'd been brought up a Catholic, given it all up, become a hippie, then a communist, then feminist, all that business. But I remember I was still a very radical, serious feminist, you know. I mean, serious. I did some really serious internal work. So I remember it was the biggest part for me was this massive shock, a culture shock I'd been a hippie 10 years before. I'd hear all these hippies. I couldn't believe, I'm not quite 10 years, 6 years, 8 years before I'd been a hippie, and hear all these hippies. For me, it was like a bad dream, you know, going back into this weird environment of all these hippies. This culture shock was so intense, and all the men did all the work, and all the men got all the praise, and the women were called ladies, and the women, because it was a pretty basic place, you had to carry buckets of water, and the women couldn't carry buckets of water because they're ladies, and it was just too intense for me. I could not believe this bizarre environment, but I knew I had to stay. I knew there was something there. I knew this is where I belonged, but it was like a nightmare. I could tell you in many ways, culturally, and trying to sift my way through these bizarre ideas, you know, trying to find the reality, find some essence in it, you know. But Lama Yeshe was one who did it for me, I swear to you. So anyway, the interesting part was the second month, there was the opportunity to either do a Tara retreat just on your own with a group, not with Lama, or to do a Chenrezig retreat with a teaching by Lama on this particular text, which is written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama when he was 19 at the request of one of his students. And it's called the Inseparability of the Spiritual Master, the Guru, the Lama, and Chenrezig, you know, and it's you'll see, it's the sweetest practice. I mean, yeah, I was going to provide it I didn't do anything. I didn't provide you with any course notes at all this time. I'm so sorry. But I would really encourage you to get the book. It's so beautiful. It's called Becoming the Compassion Buddha, published by Wisdom, and the sadhana is in there. There it is. Yeah. Thank you, Mary. Wonderful. And we might even just mention a bit in the sadhana, maybe just even do one of the little meditations, because I remember vividly. So, but first of all, my own experience was, it was really intense decision to make, because I was a radical feminist, and so I thought Tara made sense. But I loved Lama. I couldn't resist Lama Yeshe, even though I really mean it. I mean, I was a serious feminist. I don't know if you people know what a serious feminist is. I was a serious feminist, radical feminist, and then became a radical lesbian feminist, and then I became a radical lesbian separatist feminist. I mean, the serious feminists on the planet. I mean it sincerely. I don't think you people know. So that was an enormous shift for me to realize I couldn't keep hating half the human race, the male part. And I knew that was something I had to change. And then I fell into this lap of these lamas. And I would look at Lama Yeshe and love him and just loved everything about him. But it was infuriating that it was in a male body. It was such a tension for me. I know it sounds peculiar, but I was so serious, you know. But this was such a shift from my mind, but I couldn't resist him. I loved Lama Yeshe so much. He just, every word he said, the way he said it, it just was sort of, it was like a relief, his words. And that's what they call the power of speech. The power of speech is that you hear the words and you feel relieved. You know, the person with the power of speech, just by hearing their voice, can calm you, can steady your emotions. You know, that's the way Lama Yeshe was. It was astonishing, actually. It was a real struggle for me. I knew it was a struggle mentally, enormous struggle for me. So then I decided I'd do the Chenrezig retreat with this retreat. But what was so interesting, all these endless, wonderful meditations, as you'll see if you read the book, and we'll do a couple of the meditations, they're so sweet. Lots of different variations he would lead. It was a very experiential retreat. But I remember I couldn't cope with the idea of visualizing a male. So I visualized Chenrezig as female, just like Tara, but not with a green body, you know, because I figured that was the best I could do with my poor mind, you know. Anyway, just stupid things telling you. Yeah. So anyway, this book, this teaching. So of course it's Tantra. So the very first thing, of course, if you teach anything to do with Tantra, even the most down-to-earth way, which is all I can do, you've got to give some preliminaries. You've got to teach the three principal aspects of the path. So we mentioned these very briefly. I know whenever Lama taught any of these topics, he taught a lot of Tantra. He'd always say, I've got to do this. It's just the way I've got to do this. And he'd talk about it for 5 minutes, you know. He was wonderful. So in the book even, it's just briefly talking the three principal aspects of the path. So what that means is, as we know very well, Tantra, you know, Tantra is the final stages of the entire path to enlightenment. If you look at the whole package, this is like postgraduate, you know. So clearly, if you've done postgraduate, if you go postgraduate, you've got to do university. And if you go to university, you've got to do high school. And if you've got high school, you've got to have junior school. It's pretty obvious. And that's the Lam Rim. So the three prerequisites, the first one is you've got to have some semblance of success in the first and second scopes, which is junior school and high school, which means some semblance of understanding and appreciation for the concept of renunciation. So we hear all these words, you know, we hear them all. But I mean, unless we have studied it, so we don't understand what it means. So what does it mean? The first one, renunciation. What is this? Well, it means you're renouncing, you're giving up, you want to give up suffering and its causes. Suffering and its causes, you know. So that means you've got to know what suffering is, and you've got to know its causes are. Pretty reasonable. That's the Four Noble Truths. So suffering, there are 3 levels of suffering. We've got to know what that is, not just the ordinary level that we understand. That's the first one. We've got to know the more nuanced, the more subtle levels of suffering, which is really what characterizes Buddha's teachings, you know. We've got to understand, at least theoretically, that means we have to understand karma, how we create ourselves, how everything we think and do and say produces the person we become. We are the boss, you know. That's why we start to recognize, sometimes when we start to hear about karma, we get very freaked out, all these negative imprints. And especially if you hear Lama Zopa talking, it's like medieval, you know, it's like the medieval, you're going to go to hell realms for 42 eons and all this, and we kind of have a panic attack. But that's just how they talk. Lama Yeshe never talked that way, you know. So, I mean, it might be true, but he doesn't talk like that. But the thing is, when we start to get some confidence, not fear, from the concept of karma, it's very powerful. You see, if we have so much fear right now because we think someone else is running the show, we've got this conspiracy theory, and I'm not trying to be rude here, a conspiracy theory that someone created the universe and that they've got a plan and we don't know anything about it. So it's a big ask to sort of surrender everything and have faith in this person. And I'm not criticizing. If you can surrender everything and have complete faith in a creator who has a plan, who runs the universe because they made the universe, then that you've got to have a pretty good life. 99% of Muslims and Christians and the rest do not have that level. That's a pretty profound level of reality, I would say, having complete and total faith that there is a being called God who does know what he's doing, who is perfect, and who runs the show. And he's got a plan, but he can keep his plan in his pocket. He doesn't have to tell us his plan, but we know that whatever happens is his plan. That's pretty profound, I tell you. And then if you had lived like this, you would relax. Whatever happens is God's will. You hear people talk like this, really devoted Muslims, really devoted Christians. Unbelievable. But that just happens to be not the Buddhist view, that's all. So the Buddha's view is, no, sorry, there's no conspiracy theory, there's no creator, there's no one up there pulling the strings. We are the creator. And this is the biggest shock of the universe. This really takes us time. This really takes us time to understand. And the thing from this that comes isn't fear, but confidence. You mean I'm in charge? You mean I can choose? You mean I can decide? Wow. This is what comes from the view of karma. So getting the sense that we are the creators of our own universe. His Holiness calls it self-creation. So fear can't come from that, because when you know you're in charge, you know you're the boss. So sort of like you know that food is not the boss over you, that you can learn to be in control of the food, and means you have to understand the food, you have to understand good food, bad food, and you're going to watch it like a hawk. And of course you're not going to put a bad food in your mouth because you don't want future suffering. We understand that. We're very good at this. Well, the same here with the mental food. We are the boss. We are the boss. We are the boss. Self-creation, getting this concept, and therefore naturally wanting to learn from the Buddha. He's our mental nutritionist. What is valid and what is not? What is healthy food and what is not? What is a valid state of mind and what is not? Of course, we want to learn it because we don't want to suffer. So it's an encouraging view, not a fearful view, knowing that all the seeds we plant will ripen in the future. Of course, the first level of practice is focusing on the suffering, is focusing on the bad food, what you should avoid. But then it also refers to the good food, what you should eat, the virtues. So when we start to have some confidence that we can be in charge of our own lives, and we can create virtue, we can have as many positive thoughts as we like. It was very interesting. Recently, one person, I forget, maybe it was one of those, I do these 2-minute things on whatever it is, Facebook or something. And talking about learning to begin to control the negative ones, but then in their place, consciously have a positive thought. And somebody responded, which is really interesting, which is how we all are. Oh, I never thought that I could have a positive thought. You see, because we treat our minds so passively that we just notice what arises because the old habits are there, but we never think we can put new thoughts in the place. This is a very fascinating concept. It was a revelation, she said, that she could actually decide to put new thoughts in. Hey, people, it's our mind. So instead of just being obsessed with all the weeds in our garden, obsessed with all the weeds, panic-stricken about all the weeds there, you can actually learn to pull them out and grow some positive ones, grow some flowers, Then you get more confidence. Then you get more courage from this view of karma. It's empowering, not fear-making, This is the first level, understanding suffering and its causes. And then realizing I am sick of this suffering. I am up to here with suffering. And I want to get the hell out of this samsara. That's renunciation, basically. And of course, that goes to incredibly subtle levels. And every single day, you know, it's going to get deeper and deeper and deeper as we practice. So having a semblance of understanding of this and an appreciation for this and a sincere wish, therefore, to be driven by this wish to get the hell out of suffering, because you're up to here with it, you're sick of it, you're sick of it, you're sick of it, you know. Of course, there are 3 levels of suffering. The first one is the suffering of suffering, which is when the horrible things happen. But the second one is more subtle. You're sick of the suffering caused by attachment. And the third one is the most subtle of all, and it's the actual one, which is the unique one of the Buddha, which is where he diverged from the Hindus. They had methods to stop this first kind of suffering. They had methods to get rid of the second kind of suffering, but not the third one, which is the final one. So that is called all pervasive suffering, which is basically being caught up in the ignorance, that the root delusion that believes I'm intrinsic, and therefore everything else is intrinsic. So that is the cause of the actual suffering of being locked in this rebirth process, you know. So so the first method to get rid of the first kind of suffering, you've got to go to junior school and abide by the laws of karma. To get rid of the second kind of suffering, the suffering of change, which is caused by attachment, you go to the second scope, high school, and you give up attachment. And to give up all the suffering altogether and get the hell out of samsara altogether, to cut the root, you realize emptiness. So then you got the second prerequisite, and now we've got the compassion wing. And there are 2 here. The next one is having a genuine appreciation for and an understanding of compassion and all the virtues, you know, the compassion and the virtues. Bodhicitta, and finally, which culminate in bodhicitta, this outrageous attitude. It's not the same as compassion, it's the culmination of compassion. This outrageous attitude that causes you to only want to help whoever's in front of you, only want to be of benefit to whoever's in front of you, and knowing it's your job. The courage of the bodhisattva. And then the long-term view of never giving up life after life after life until you've perfected this and you've become a Buddha, because then you're qualified to help others. Bodhicitta. And the third prerequisite, these 3 principles of the path, or 3 principal aspects of the path, or 3 principal paths, Lama Zopa uses that, which is a variation of the packaging of the Lam Rem, renunciation. Second one, bodhicitta. Third one, appreciation for and some understanding of emptiness. Emptiness. So these are the prerequisites to enter into, you know, enter into a practice that's called Tantra. So within Tantra, there are 4 levels, 4 different, I mean, there's thousands. You know, I know very little, so the few things I do know, I'll tell you. But you know, there's the 4 levels. There's 4 types and levels of Tantra. So this Chenrezig practice is the first one. It's called Action Tantra or Kriya Tantra, and there are various characteristics that qualify each of these stages, you know, of practice. So in general, it's always excellent to get an empowerment, which is like a permission from the Lama, you get a transmission from the Lama and gives you the empowerment to practice these practices. But there are some, like Kriya Tantra, that you can do without having received an empowerment. And this is one of those practices. Such as Chen, you know, different levels of practice of Tara, Chenrezig, Manjushri, many of those. This is why we practice them without having received an empowerment. Then there are some that you can't do without an empowerment. They're called usually the ones that are referred to as the practices in the 4th of these 4, which is called highest Tantra or highest Yoga Tantra, Maha Anuttara Yoga Tantra, whatever. And those you might have heard, Vajrayogini, Yamantaka, Guhya Samaja, these different practices, they are in the highest one. Those you can't practice until you've received an empowerment. So this one, okay, then the next point is, in these different practices we're doing within Tantra, there's 2 different ways you visualize. 2 different ways you visualize. One is you visualize the Buddha themselves, the actual Buddha, Tara, Chenrezig, whatever. In this case, Chenrezig. But the other way, which is a very sweet way that makes it very personal, and this is this kind, in the first one, you visualize like the practice we do every Saturday morning, we're doing now the last year, the Sangha running these short practices of a Chenrezig practice and a recitation of a certain prayer to help for the suffering of all the people suffering from as a result of the pandemic. We've done it for more than a year now. Every Saturday we do it. 24 hours all around the world, led by the FPMT monks and nuns. And I do the Saturday morning one at 7 o'clock Mountain Time. So anyway, there we visualize Chenrezig in this form of the Buddha, which I'm going to talk about. And then you imagine that Buddha is the manifestation of your Lama's mind. So the other practice, which makes it very personal, and this is this kind, is where you visualize the guru in their form, and in their heart is the deity, and that's this kind here. So it's a very sweet one. So this one, of course, we visualized His Holiness. There's a drawing in the book, I think, an illustration of His Holiness in the very classical style, Gelugpa with his yellow pointy hat, and at his heart is Chenrezig, you know. So that's a very kind of makes it very personal. It's very, very personal, very sweet, that one. So, okay, so why? So there's many ways of characterizing practices within what's called Tantra. So first, there's the philosophical understanding, the understanding of the philosophy, of the psychology of Tantra. And this is something that Lama Yeshe, I swear to you, specialized in. In many ways, he was quite radical. He taught in a way that was absolutely not traditional. He somehow had this extraordinary ability. When he first met, you know, mostly it was white people in the beginning, hippies, Western hippies, Australians, Americans, some Europeans. They were his first students. Australians and Americans first, I think, and some European, no, some English as well, and then some other, French, Europeans, French, German, Dutch, Australian, the first lot of students, all Europeans. There weren't many Asians around then. Now many, many students, and then none from Africa that I can think, none from other countries that I can think, no Indians. Now many, many Indians, a whole generation of people from India are becoming Buddhist, you know. I remember when I lived in Delhi, when I first became a nun, I lived in Delhi and worked for our center there, Tushita. I remember the Indians, the local Indians would come because they all love Lord Buddha. He's one of the 19 something or others. They just love Lord Buddha, you know. They're in love with Shiva and God, but they just think they all love Lord Buddha. But they didn't become Buddhist. I remember one time recently, actually 5 years ago, when I was in Mumbai, giving a talk, and like 100 people there, all Indians, of course, it's Mumbai, and they all love Buddhist teachings. They all love Buddhist teachings. They all decided they were going to take refuge. Then I started talking about refuge, and you had to decide, you know, it's like when you can love girls or boys, and then you get married, you've got to have one. You don't usually marry 6 or 7 unless you're a Mormon, you know. So, you know, you got to choose one. They all had a panic attack because they didn't want to give up their Hindu ideas. They all love Buddha, but they sort of thought they had to choose between Buddha and God, and they couldn't. So they all stopped being a Buddhist, you know. But so then you got to know where you belong. It's another whole discussion. The Indians loving Buddhism. Anyway, where was I? Chenrezig, what was I saying? I've lost the plot. All these, that's right, Lama Yeshe and all his first students, these hippies, and they're all mostly hippies. They all started coming to Kathmandu. For whatever reason, don't ask me. Western hippies conflated enlightenment with drugs. I presume we had this bizarre idea that when you spaced out on drugs, you got enlightened. God almighty, I do not know. But it was such a weird idea. And then when they started looking at Tibetan people, and Tibetans are very medieval, the way they dress. Now they're different. They dress like us. But they know before they were dressing, the men would have long dresses and long hair, and they're swirled up on their heads with big coral earrings. So they thought they were hippies. But Tibetans are the most conservative people. If they dress like Western people, they'd be having shirts and ties, and the ladies would have high heels and their gloves and their handbags. They're really conservative. But Western people saw a bunch of hippies. So it was a complete wrong conflation, you know. Anyway, they started coming to India, to Kathmandu, and meeting the lamas in Kopan Monastery in these courses that were starting there. And then from that's when the first students, like Nick and these other 4 people, Australians, met the lamas there in like 71, 72, and then went back to Australia and then started this first center in Australia. So what am I talking about? So Lama Yeshe from the very beginning, Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe, I think first met Western students in Darjeeling, actually, their very first Western student, a woman called Zina, who'd been living in America. Lama Yeshe always called her a Russian princess. I think she was an Estonian aristocrat or something, but Lama preferred Russian princess. Don't ask me why. Anyway, Zina. And then from there, they went to Kathmandu and they started meeting these, American and Europeans and Australian hippies. So Lama, from the very beginning, actually from the very beginning, Lama Zopa too, he's 10 years younger than Lama Yeshe. They met each other when Lama Zopa was 14. Soon after they'd come out, Lama Zopa was just on the border of Tibet and Nepal. He was in Tibet, so he had to escape in 59. Lama Yeshe escaped from Lhasa, and they both ended up in this place in what's it called? Something, I've forgotten the name, where they stayed. All the Tibetans were put. This used to be a prison camp, so they met there. And Lama Zopa was 14, and Lama Yeshe, or 15, and Lama Yeshe was 25. And they first met, and Lama became his Lama, And so I know then Lama Zopa started learning English even as a little boy. When he was in this camp, he would because they memorized things in the monastery, so he started memorizing the dictionary. Or he memorized Time magazine. He tried to memorize, because that's how you learn, you see. He started learning English automatically, but so did Lama Yeshe. So when this Zina met them in Darjeeling in about 65 or 66, I think, I can't remember, they already were learning a bit of English, but sort of like chaotic English, completely chaotic. And Lama Yeshe, what I so admire about him, I mean, I don't speak any other language because I'm too proud. Unless I say it perfectly, I'm not going to say it. It's just a lazy mind, But Lama Yeshe, he just somehow, and I never get over it, I can't get over it when I understand Tibetan style, Tibetan culture. It was literally medieval. And I'm not joking. It was isolated for 1,000 years. It was isolated. So everything was retained in the monasteries. It's exactly how it was medieval times. No, that's not joking. And the good side of that was all the philosophy and everything stayed intact, didn't become polluted. So Lama, he just somehow learned how to talk like a modern hippie. It was so incredible when I think about the difference. If you hear a classical Tibetan teaching and then you hear Lama Yeshe talk, it's so radically different. It was like, for me, I'd joke and say it was like he was born as a hippie, But he had no grammar, no kind of proper structure. And sometimes when I'm reading his transcripts trying to edit him, it's like you've got to intuit the meaning. But his words were just perfect words. He somehow knew exactly how to talk to us, understood, like he just understood. It was extraordinary. That's wisdom. It really is wisdom, knowing how to help a person. So from the very beginning, he could see that Western people, because we're living in a culture that's just dripping in attachment, our culture is the personification of the success of attachment. Meaning we have endless numbers of marvelous things, endless numbers of marvelous objects of the senses. So and that's what we're going to get to now, the philosophy of Tantra. Lama could see immediately that somehow our minds were ripe and ready to hear what perhaps Tibetans were not ready for, because their culture was so profoundly different. So traditionally, you don't go anywhere near Tantra. You'll do various practices in your little child in the monastery. You'll learn, memorize prayers and things from Tantra, but you won't study it until after you've studied all the other teachings. I mean, these Geshis, they do their 20 or whatever years of the sutra teachings, pass their Geshe exams, then they go on to learn Tantra. But Lama could see from the very beginning that we had this ability, because of our degenerate culture, because of our, a culture seeped in attachment, dripping in attachment, a manifestation of attachment, and because Tantra is essentially a brilliant philosophy that's based on understanding attachment and how to use it and transform it. And Lama thought he felt that we were capable of understanding that concept, So this is very much the way he taught. So the whole concept in Tantra then, okay, so when we understand attachment, which is the crucial thing to understand is attachment. And that means that's the high school teachings. The junior school, the first scope, you learn about karma. You learn about controlling your body and your speech, the servants of your mind, the part of us that do the harm to others. What for? Why? Driven by what's in the mind. You can't handle the mind till you can handle your body and speech. So the first level is control the body and speech. Then you get to the next level, and now you begin to unpack and unravel your mind. And here is where you learn the Buddhist model of the mind. And I see this repeatedly, and it's so true, that even though the words attachment, love, compassion, jealousy, we all know those words are universal. They're not Buddhist. but he's got a particular, specific view of the states of mind. And until we understand this view that, for example, there's three different categories of states of mind, there's no fourth, that all the thousands of states of mind that we have can be divided into these three very precisely, and that kind of precision, which is internal, not the brain. This is the unique thing of Buddhist psychology. So then the key job of being a Buddhist then is to learn to distinguish between the neurotic, deluded, ridiculous states of mind that are the source of all our pain and suffering, because they're rooted in ego grasping, which is the main delusion, which assumes a separate me. And then you got the virtuous, positive states of mind, love and compassion and kindness, that are not deluded and that are our saving grace. So this is the fundamental point in Buddhist psychology. So understanding attachment is absolutely fundamentally important if you want to say you're a Buddhist. If you don't understand it, then you're not a Buddhist. You can't say, it's like you're pretending. So we have to know what it is and what it's not, you know. And why we need to know this, because if you want to get to university level, not to mention postgraduate, where you're going to transform attachment, you had better know what the hell it is you're transforming. So it's not possible to practice and to understand Tantra until you've understood high school, which is where you learn about the mind. So the key thing, the whole one way of describing all of the tantric philosophy, tantric psychology, is in terms of utilizing the poison. It's a good way to, they say it like this. So, you know, that they talk about alchemists. I mean, I don't know if there's such a people around anymore who can take ordinary and make it sublime. You can talk about a person, actually I think it's, isn't that homeopathy is like that, isn't it? You give a tiny amount of the poison and it becomes a medicine. So anybody who's a decent horticulturist or a decent herbalist, herbalists, really skillful herbalists, I'm sure, I don't know much about these things, can recognize poison and herbs and know all the difference and know the function of all of them. But if the really most advanced ones can extract the essence from the seemingly harmful ones and use them as medicine, that is exactly the analogy for the psychology of Tantra. Exactly the analogy, you know. So they talk, and this is how Lama Yeshe talks in the book. So how this is, So the very first level of practice is, given that we're driven by attachment, because effectively you can argue that the Buddha is saying in the Four Noble Truths that we are driven by, that attachment is our main problem, effectively. Even though the root delusion, which gets us born in the first place, is called ego grasping, the delusion, ignorance, the one that when it clings to me is called ego grasping, the primordial misconception of a self in the first place. But effectively the main result of that, the main consequence of that is attachment to get what that fantasy I wants. And that is effectively the main cause of our suffering in daily life. It's the cause of our getting reborn again and again. It's the cause of our having bodies, sensory bodies, objects of the senses, and therefore attachment, you know. So the very first level, you control the servants of attachment and the other delusions. You just back off and don't harm sentient beings. The next level, you've controlled, you've subdued your body and speech to some degree. Now you've got the luxury to be able to look into your mind and begin to distinguish between the delusions and the virtues, but particularly to understand attachment. So Buddha talks about thousands of states of mind, thousands of delusions, 84,000 they talk about, but they're all subsumed to these three. It's a very clear model of the mind, very distinct. There's nothing equivalent in modern psychology. That's a fact. In neuroscience, it's a fact. So these three, Buddha sweetly calls them the three poisons. We can call them the three toxic emotions. I like that. So the root one is ignorance. On the basis of this one, this separate sense of a dualistic, separate sense of a self, neurotic and fear-based, then which is, you know, naturally gives rise to attachment, this emotional hunger that's frantic to get what that supposed I wants. And that's what runs the show to degrees of subtlety that, of course, we can't even see until we're highly advanced, you know. So we've got to start where we are, which is the grossest level. The objects, craving for the objects to the senses, you know. That's why you control the senses first. You control the body and speech. But to begin to understand attachment is absolutely vital if you want to have some semblance of understanding of how you can transform it. Otherwise, it's just a fantasy. And here you learn this in high school, when you learn about the mind. So what does it mean then to use attachment, transform attachment? or anger for that matter, any of them. Because one way of describing the practices in Tantra, okay, there's another thing, and they link. So leave that one for a second. Now we'll go to this one. Another way of describing Tantra is in terms of all the practices, which are these practices of the visualizations of all these different Buddhas. Because what we're going to be what we try to do in Tantra is become that Buddha. It's another method. All the methods in Buddhism are methods of becoming a Buddha. Finally, they all lead to that. But this is a very specific approach where you visualize, like say Chenrezig, as the personification of compassion, a totally perfected being in front of you. And as they say, one way of looking at these tantric practices of visualization and then internalizing that and as a method of becoming that, they talk about how you're bringing the future result into the present. So it's like the ultimate in positive thinking. You imagine yourself winning Wimbledon. You imagine yourself doing that thing. That's one of the causes of becoming it. That's exactly what these practices are. So all these different Buddhas, okay, so right back. What's Buddha? What's a Buddha then? Buddha, this word, refers to the mind, the totally developed mind, the mind that has rid itself completely of all delusions, and the mind that has perfected itself with all the virtues. That's a Buddha. So that is a pure, unmanifest, all-pervasive, all-compassionate, all-wise, all-powerful consciousness. And at that point, no need for bags of bones, no need for boring old bodies, because that's finished. All the negative karma is finished. There is only virtue and only wisdom. And that mind, being non-physical, can only be wherever there is existence. This is how they talk in Christianity or in Islam. God is everywhere. I used to love that idea as a little girl, a Catholic. I was in love with the concept of God. I didn't think about Jesus much. I like God. All pervasive, all knowing, all seeing. God is everywhere, they'd say. And I'd think about what God is everywhere means. I'd look into I remember looking into my, not my course notes, my homework. And I'm looking in the margin. I'd say, God is in the margin of my, and I thought, what does that mean? I couldn't get it. I look in the light switch. God is in the light switch. I tried to get the concept. I couldn't get it, I still can't, doesn't matter. But this is the same as Buddha. It's very similar things. The Buddha mind, all knowing, all seeing, all compassion, all wise, not physical, doesn't need body, and all pervasive, because if it's not physical, how can it be confined by space or time or matter? Not a possibility, isn't it? Our mind right now, which is also not physical, but is locked into this bag of bones. Why? Because of delusions, because of intense, countless lifetimes of deluded views, that we're kind of paralyzing ourselves. We're locked inside this body. We can't see past our own noses, quite literally, because we're so deluded. But our mind, as it expands and progressively develops in virtue and gets rid of delusions, and it becomes the mind of a Buddha, we literally continue to expand our consciousness until it pervades the universe. I mean, literally. That's Buddha. That's known in Sanskrit as the truth body. It's an odd word, Dharma Kaya, body Kaya, Sanskrit. That's the actual Buddha. That's the actual Buddha. But who can communicate with that? Nobody. We're too gross. So what does the Buddha do? That mind, naturally driven by compassion and having the wisdom and the power to do so, manifests in bodies that beings can communicate with. And there are two of those, two kinds. Thousands of bodies, but two kinds of bodies. And one is called the Emanation Body, and that's represented by behind me, Shakyamuni Buddha, the gentleman, the human Indian person who lived on the planet 2,500 years ago. That's the Nirmanakaya, the Emanation Body. Now that one regular Joes like you and me can communicate with. Back then we would have seen this human being who is the Buddha's mind manifesting as a human body. Okay, there's different ways of talking about the Buddha. The Mahayana view was that he became a Buddha a long time before that, and he was living in the Tushita Pure Land, and then it was time to get born as a human to show humans how to become Buddha. And of course, the other view, the Theravadan view, is that what he showed was real. He was an ordinary person who became a Buddha. Because there's quite a few differences in the interpretation of Buddhism in the Hinayana, the Theravadan views and the Mahayana views. So anyway, but we would have seen this nice gentleman, this nice male person back then, looking like all the other sadhus. Actually, wouldn't have known Buddha from anybody. He would have been walking around with his yellow robe on, looking like all the other thousands of sadhus running around India, all these holy beings. So anyway, that's the Nirmanakaya. They call it the Supreme Nirmanakaya. Then you've got a more subtle form that the Buddha manifests in for the sake of the more advanced practitioners in the Mahayana, the Arya Bodhisattvas, Arya superior, who've realized emptiness. They can cognize this one in their mind, in their meditation. And this is called the enjoyment body, the Sambhogakaya. So some of the holiest beings can see that with their own eyes right now, you know, like apparently Tsongkhapa received all his teachings directly from the Buddha of wisdom in the Sambhogakaya form. I mentioned this morning in our meditation, for example, there's this student of Rinpoche's, and she's also one of his lamas, Kadrala. I don't know what her name is. There are many Kadralas. It's a female term for female practitioners. Anyway, she's Vajrayogini. She's a holy being, you know. And Rinpoche, I remember in 2019 when I was at Kopan, Rinpoche said, she's my first lady Lama. He's got one lady. He's got about 50 male Lamas. He's got this one lady. My first lady Lama, he said. Anyway, she's wonderful. But she was this little girl who was realized from the time she was born, Lama Zopa said. Highly realized being, and she had this yearning to get from Tibet. She crawled over the mountains herself, got over the mountain. She was like 13 or something. I don't remember the details, and got to Dharamsala, desperate to see His Holiness. Well, I mean, who is going to pay attention to the little 13-year-old girl? Not the Tibetans, that's for sure. I mean, nobody would. So and the thing as well, so she when she'd see His Holiness in the street, like he'd be driving in the car, she'd faint because she would be seeing directly the Sambhogakaya, you know. A holy being. So eventually she got a meeting. She was desperate to do these long life pujas for His Holiness. And so Kirti Senchab Rinpoche, one of Lama Zopa's lamas, one of my lamas, she got a meeting with him, and he could see exactly who she was. So he said, I will build a golden bridge between you and His Holiness. It was so sweet, you know. So she got to meet His Holiness, and she's a little girl, for God's sake. And he told his attendants, do exactly what she tells you. She ran the whole thing. And there's this lovely story at the puja she organized. Nearby in Dharamsala, there's some cave or something related to Tilopa, one of those great Indian yogis, you know. So the monks who were there, she went there and she asked him to give her a little vase, a little container. And she got one of the rocks and she squeezed the rock, and this yellow nectar came out of it. And she filled this little container and she gave it to His Holiness at the puja, and he drank the lot. So she's a holy being. And she could see the Sambhogakaya because she was highly realized. And so many people can do that. So the Arya Bodhisattvas, at least those who realize emptiness, can see in their meditation. The best we can do is visualize. So what's the difference between those forms and this one? Well, it's obvious, evident. If you look at the Buddha here and see it as a manifestation of qualities, not just, you see, we're so used to art. In our culture, we think of art in a very different way. In this Buddhist approach, this form is like a language. It's telling you something. So what's that telling you? Have a look at the Buddha in the form of the monk. What is it telling us? It's telling us it's completely subdued body, subdued speech, and subdued mind. It's the manifestation of the success of the wisdom wing. Subdued body, speech, and mind. That's what it represents. Now, what is blissful Chenrezig or blissful Tara or Vajrayogini or all these other dudes in Tantra? What do they represent? They're quite different. They're not different insofar as they are manifestations of different psychological qualities. That's fundamental. Who do you think you are? Have a look at yourself. We're so addicted to our bodies. As Lama Zopa says, Lama Yeshe says, we make the body the boss. We identify as our body. We say, this is me. We vaguely know we've got thoughts and feelings, but we don't make a distinction. But just this big lump of me is this big lump of body, isn't it? It's so deeply instinctive within us, you know? So we are also a visual language. So not being rude about anybody, but if you see a person, you know, walking down, you see Buddha, there he is manifesting controlled body, speech, and mind. If you see Chenrezig, he is the visual language manifesting infinite compassion and love. We might know that, but we can learn it. Now, if you will see a person walking down the street who can't stand up straight, falling over and vomiting, you can see that person is a manifestation of completely out of control attachment to alcohol. It's hardly rocket science. I mean, we can see the body is an indicator of what is going on in the mind. We can't see the mind. We often misinterpret what the body is doing, but if we had some wisdom, we would see by looking at a person, and you have some wisdom, you could see their mind. It's a manifestation of what's in their mind. We are a manifestation of whatever is in our mind. If there's a tendency to steal in your mind, what do you think your body will do? Your hand will take something, it doesn't belong to you. If you've got a tendency to lie in your mind, what do you think your speech will do? It will say words that aren't true. What if you've got strong attachment to jumping on boys? Well, your body will jump on boys. Your body does what your mind wants. The body is a manifestation of what's in your mind. So in both of these, we're trying to lift our game and identify, and this is especially in Tantra, with our future potential. So one way of looking at the Lam Rim practice is you're digging all the dirt, you're digging into, you've got your hands in your own shit, as a friend of mine said, a therapist and a meditator, a Buddhist. Or I'd say you're tasting your own vomit, you're dealing with your garbage, you're knee deep in your shitty garden, pulling out all the weeds and getting very dirty. That's the first level of practice, and that's why we get a bit overwhelmed. Now we get to the tantric level, and here we're learning to completely lift ourselves out of the muck and to identify with our future potential. So it's very uplifting. And that's why from the very beginning, Lama would try to, all the time he talked about divine pride, try to get us to lift our game and stop identifying with our garbage. That's what we do. Because our garden's full of weeds, we keep thinking my garden's a load of rubbish, my garden is a disaster. When you realize that you can pull out those weeds and you can then identify the beautiful garden by its flowers, the potential. This is where it's very uplifting. That's why even these meditations can be so uplifting for us to do them. Instead of dealing all the time with the negativity, which can overwhelm us, but to start to identify with our potential, bringing the future result into the present. So that's combined with this concept of trying to, utilize, okay, so forget even utilizing attachment, but activating consciously the virtues. So why that? Well, there's a key thing that's so crucial in Buddhist psychology, and which shouldn't take too long to prove, but we can't quite see it, is that we're miserable. Why are we miserable all the time? Because we are identifying with our delusions. We've got weeds and flowers in our mind, but unfortunately the weeds loom large. We notice them more. We're more obsessed with the weeds. It's the irony of ego, So all the time when we're miserable, we're identifying with our anger, identifying with our jealousy and our fears and our drama and our negativity, pointing them out constantly. Now they are there. There are weeds in my garden. But you're obsessing about the weeds. You're not noticing the flowers can also be there. You're not noticing you can pull out a weed and put a flower in. We don't notice that. So we have to cultivate that view very strongly. So this is really the essence of what we're trying to do psychologically in the tantric path. We visualize our future result and we imagine becoming that. So it's not fantasy. It's actually a method for achieving it. But what it does is, in a day-to-day sense, it lifts us. So yes, we know we've got garbage in the mind, but because you're trying to identify with your goodness. So this is the point. Why are we miserable? Because of delusions. Why are we happy? Because of virtues. So this is also another whole discussion we can spend the rest of the month on. Happiness is another word for pleasant feelings, for joy. There's a whole spectrum of happiness. We can see that. But we're so addicted to happiness is that something that comes when you meet the attachment object. We identify happiness as the happiness of a junkie, the relief of a kind of a craving, That's desperate. That's not happiness. It's some semblance of happiness there. I mean, technically the word happiness means pleasant feeling. There definitely are some pleasant feelings, but it's so contaminated by the attachment that it makes it a junkie one. The junkie craves something, you get a bit of satisfaction and you call it happiness. Whereas the happiness that we're talking here, and don't think of it as holy. Don't think of it as holy, please. It's the happiness, the joy, the sense of connectedness with others that comes from cultivating kindness, cultivating love, cultivating compassion, and then your body and speech reaching out and doing something for other people. I mean, ordinary people know this. You don't have to be a Buddhist or a Christian to know this. This is not religious. This is practical psychology. I mean, one of my sisters who has no interest and never has not even a remote interest in any religion ever, even though she was brought up Catholic, just like the rest of us. She had no interest in it all her life, but she's got incredibly natural virtue. And on the phone yesterday, she said, well, of course, happiness comes from helping others. She said it like a no-brainer, you know. But look at people who are not happy. It seems so remote, doesn't it? Because you feel so, when you're not happy, I'm not being mean about us. You know, there's a sense of loneliness. No one loves me. No one gives me anything. I've got no one to talk to. But it never occurs to us that we could become happy if we reached out to others. But it feels like hard work, doesn't it? Because we feel like this sense of entitlement. This is the problem with us. Not being mean about us. But she just said it was so shocking the way she said it. Blew my mind, you know. Well, what do you think? She said, of course, happiness comes from helping others. That's the only way to get happy, she said. And she wasn't being moralistic. She just said it naturally. I mean, I almost prostrated to her. It took me years to understand this. Couldn't believe it. She couldn't care less about God or incarnation or reincarnation or Timbuktu. Just never arises in her mind. She's not against it. She just never thinks about it. Just couldn't care. Different people's minds, isn't it? So happy feelings that come from love and compassion and kindness and generosity and self-respect, that's what happiness is. That's right now, not to mention the actions we do now that will ripen in the future as happy feelings. It's a very simple point, but it's so complicated for us and it feels very moralistic. So what we're trying to do in Tantra is lift our mind and learn to be happy. Learn to be joyful. I mean, that's it. Lama can see that from the day one with these poor self-pity hippies. You people don't know how to be happy, he said. You know how to suffer. You know how to be self-piteous and miserable, obsessing about our negativity. So he'd give us these practices. He would get us to do Tantra from day one in the most simplest way, you know, to lift us, to force us to identify with our goodness, not obsessing about our negativity. Of course, the negativity is there. And of course, we should be on the case. And of course, it's sort of like if you're a nutritionist, but you're obsessed all the time with fear about the bad food and fear of getting diabetes and fear of eating the wrong sugar. You live in complete panic attack. But once you know nutrition, it becomes internalized and you'll just know automatically what to eat and what not to eat. And then you'll learn to get healthy and happy by eating the right things. This is a mental state. This is a mental one, that's all. So you have to learn to have the courage to identify with our goodness, to have what they call in Tantra divine pride. It's a beautiful saying. Self-respect. I mean, the irony of ego is we hate ourselves. The irony of ego is we have low self-esteem, as we call it. We think we're creeps. Our negativity, our big nose and our wrong stomach loom large to us. Everybody you think of in the world, even the people you think are the most divine people on the planet. When we look at other people with, aren't they beautiful? If only I could be beautiful like them. I saw a documentary about Audrey Hepburn. Everybody on the planet thought she was the most divine woman. Didn't like her nose, thought her legs were too short, her knees were the wrong shape, her ear went the wrong way. Everybody's like that. Marilyn Monroe, whom the entire world worshipped, thought she was a lump of garbage, you know. I mean, we're quite schizophrenic, you've got to admit. And that's how we all are. That's how our negativity is. That's how delusions talk. We obsess about. So, of course, in the beginning, when you don't know nutrition, you've got to watch like a hawk. You've got to be careful because you don't know where sugar is. But once you know it so well, then you'll be confident, you know. So once we know karma really well, we can be confident and know that we can create bucket loads of positivity every second. And we won't be scared of the negativity. So the tantric practices are identifying with our future result. And so because every thought counts, every thought sows a karmic seed, it is a powerful practice. Everything you think leaves a seed in the mind. So think positive thoughts, how marvelous. So these practices, so all these Buddhas, okay, so you've got like, you know, you've got Buddha, the word Buddha, that's the Dharmakaya. Then you've got what they call the Rupakaya, I didn't mention that. That means form body. And then there's two of those, the Sambhogakaya and the Nirmanakaya. So under one, the Nirmanakaya is the Shakyamuni Buddha, this one. The other one is the boss Buddha for us in the Gelugpas of Shakyamuni in Tantra is called Vajradhara, or in Tibetan, Dorje Chung. And then Vajrasattva is a white version of him. He's like the primordial Buddha, the general Buddha in Tantra, like Shakyamuni's, the Buddha in Sutra. Then under Dorji Chang or Vajradhara, you've got 5 Buddha families. There's 5 divisions: Amitabha, Akshobhya, Vairocana, whatever they are, Ratnasambhava and Amoghasiddhi. And they each represent many things, but in this one section here, in this way of talking here, they each represent the particular purified aspect of 5 delusions. So Amitabha, he's red. He is the manifestation of purified attachment. Akshobhya is the manifestation of purified anger. Vairocana is the manifestation of purified ignorance. Like that, these 5. And then under those 5 are all the thousands and thousands of other Buddhas, all belonging to these, as they call them. People say it's not the correct term. I don't even know what the right term is. The 5 Buddha families, they say. So it's this map of, it's a psychological map, basically. So Tara, for example, Chenrezig are in the Amitabha family. Then you've got those different levels of practices within this, in this Tantra. So you've got Kriya Tantra, they're Kriya Tantra. Then you've got the highest one. So in the Amitabha family, you've got Vajrayogini, this gorgeous, sexy, red, naked lady who's the manifestation of purified attachment. Like that, So it's very delicious psychology. It's very delicious, really. So, of course, it's logical. If you don't know anything about herbs, how can you first even recognize a poison? And if you can't recognize a poison, how can you learn to transform it? It's obvious you've got to do the groundwork first, which is distinguish between the herbs and the weeds and the poison and blah, blah, blah. Then you've got the luxury to be able to use your intelligence to utilize the energy of those and transform them. Same here. Exactly the same here. So one of the approaches of Tantra is learning to be happy. Learning to be happy to us sounds very exhausting. It means you might have got to go and find boyfriends and drags and music. It sounds a lot of work. No, they're not the cause of happiness. Your mind is the cause of happiness, babies. And guess what? Having virtuous thoughts. I mean, you can be, not being rude here, you can be paralyzed from the neck down and you can be having positive thoughts. That's the cause of happiness. Not immediately. It's hard work. It's like giving up sugar and stopping eating sugar. It doesn't feel like the cause of happiness. Not in the beginning, it's torture. But eventually, the result will be a nice, healthy body. The same with the mind, So as Lama Yeshe says, we've got to learn to be content now. And content is another word for satisfied. And satisfied is the opposite to dissatisfied. And dissatisfied is the energy of attachment. Bottomless pit of junkies, Never satisfied. No matter what I do, no matter what I have, no matter what I get, no matter what I achieve, it's never enough. No matter how many weeds you pull out of your garden, all you notice is the weeds. Oh, there's still more weeds. It's like, you've got to grade 1 in music. Oh, I'm only in grade 1. Then you get to grade 976. I'm only in grade 976. You're never satisfied. So it's a bit catch-22. You've got to learn to be satisfied by saying the words, great, I'm in grade 1. Then you go to grade 2. Now, great, I've achieved grade 2. That's the attitude we have to cultivate. And it's a mental practice. It takes time. Okay, so I've been talking about an hour. How about some questions now? Any old questions, I don't care.
You can raise your hand or use the raise hand icon. Oh, Louis, it's yours. Please
Lou,
answer.
go, babe. Go, Lou.
Yes. How do we know when we download stuff from the PMT website? Yeah. How do we know which Tantra downloads we can do and which ones we can't?
You don't know. You have to learn.
Okay.
You have to learn by studying. You have to learn by going to classes like this. You don't know. So, I mean, yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah, so this is the point about what we're trying to do here in Thupten Nobu Ling, the center in Santa Fe. I'm supporting, Mary and everybody. We've got this program, we've been developing it, been about a year, starting with Mary, whole big picture of the program, Lou, that is all, it seems on the face of it, when you don't know any math, you see all the 47 classes and you don't know which one to go to. But once you learn to know the big picture, then you know which ones to go to. So one of the plans is to get like a map of the Lam Rim, which is this gradual path, then link all the teachings in all the classes to that Lam Rim. So you'll know which ones to do at which point, what level, what one. So with Tantra, you would know, immediately you would know, for example, with Sukta Norby Ling, let's say there's this class now on Chenrezig. If it's open to the public, then you would know automatically it was something you can do. But you'd know it wouldn't be something you could do because it would say only available to those who've taken the empowerment. So you sort of, you got to read the little kind of the small print. But what we're trying to do is show, so that, of course it's hard. It's a very big worldview, and especially the way it's studied in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic university system, you know, which is what we're basing ours on. So you want us to learn it. Do you understand? So doesn't it tell you when you go to buy a book on the FPMT, doesn't it tell you?
Yes, it does. Sometimes it'll say visualize crown only, and sometimes
there you go. There you go.
need
yeah. But in the general, it's not that easy. And because in the world now, there's so much available. I know even in the mid-70s, when I met the Lamas, you know, I wasn't even allowed to see the picture of Vajrasattva. But of course, everything's published in the world because the world treats Tibetan Buddhism like art. I mean, that's why all the pictures that people love Tibetan art, you know, but these are actually Tibetan, they're actually practices. They're actually meditations. You know, do you understand? That's the purpose of art in Buddhism, Tibetan anyway. So it's not that easy to know, but one can learn. And then if you don't know, you can email somebody and ask. Do you understand?
Thank you.
Yeah, good. Any other questions? Nothing. Not a single question.
I'll speak up.
Okay, Matthew, go for it, babe.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. That was the clearest explanation of the kayas and most helpful explanation of the kayas that I've heard. Thank you so much.
Oh, good, pleasure.
A quick question. Would you explain exactly what an empowerment is? I hear that a lot, but I couldn't know exactly what it is.
Exactly, I understand. So all the time with all of these things, because they, you know, there's a particular language in this particular worldview, and it's got very particular meaning, but because it's religious, especially also, we mystify it quite a bit. So I always like to use ordinary examples. So let me use this ordinary example, and you'll get my point immediately, of when I first learned to make a cake. This is also giving a good description of how you choose a teacher. It's the same process, but you listen, you'll get my point. So it was me and my cake teacher was my mum. My mom. Well, we call it mum in Australia, my mummy, okay? So I was 25, I was a hippie, and I was living in London. And I swear to you, it's like this. I never had interest in ever cooking any food, ever making any cakes, nothing. I had no interest ever. But when I was 25 and I was a hippie and I was in London, the thought arose for the first time, I'd like to make a cake. And I remember thinking it would be a carrot cake, because at the time that was a really hippie thing to do. It was a really revolutionary thing to do, to make a carrot cake, you know. So anyway, I was going home to Melbourne for my family. And then the thought arose, I'll ask my mum. I'll ask mummy how to show me how to make it. I always call her mummy. I know it sounds silly. I'm an old lady, but never mind. Ask her how to make a cake. Now, this is the point. So this is also how you find a teacher. I wanted to learn how to make a cake. Well, where do you go to learn to do anything? Obviously, you find someone, guess what, who knows how to do it. It's hardly rocket science. And that's with my mother. So why did I choose my mum? This is a really good point. Because you know why? I'd done my due diligence. I had eaten her cakes. I'd eaten her students' cakes, my sisters. Her peers said she was a good cake maker. So I had checked her reputation. I had checked the product. I had checked her students. This is exactly what you do with a teacher. You get my point, Matthew? I'd done that automatically. So then the other thing, so then I went home, and I didn't go just for the cake, I promise. But then I remember I asked my mum. So basically, what do you think I'm doing? I've done my due diligence. I've checked up. I've decided she's valid, that she knows what she's talking about. And the crucial point was, which came first, I wanted to make the cake. Now, my mother knew how to make cakes from the time I was born. She knew I didn't want it, but she didn't force me, because you can't shove it down a person's throat. So she had the wisdom to know she couldn't force me to make cakes. But here I was, finally ready. Can you imagine my darling mum, so happy after 25 years, I'm finally asking her, you know? So I said, please, in the kitchen, basically put my hands together, please, mum, Mum, show me how to make a cake. So what do you think I did? I asked her for the transmission of that knowledge from her mind into my mind. That's called an oral transmission, or even it's called an initiation, or even it's called an empowerment. Now you listen, it's logical. My mind was ready. I wanted it. I checked on her. She was valid. I asked, and she happily gave it to me. Now, this is the interesting point, Matthew. I remember that day vividly. I remember the kitchen. I remember the moment. I remember the cake. And it wasn't a carrot cake. It was an apple and walnut cake. I remember it vividly because you know why? That was the first time cakes became real for me, Matthew. All the conditions were ready. I wanted it. I checked on her. She had the knowledge. My mind was open. I asked her and she gave it to me. Well, honey child, that is an empowerment. You get my point? It's logical, isn't it? I mean, I remember the day. It was a powerful moment. As Lama Yeshe said, the Buddha's dead, you know. So the first time that the Four Noble Truths will have meaning for you is in that when you get them for the mouth of a person that you have chosen. That's the guru. My mother didn't force me. She didn't force me. I saw it. I checked on her. I recognized and I requested. So my mind was ready and I received the transmission. Now, I haven't made a cake in 20, 30 years, and I bet I can make a good cake again because I listened. My mind was ready. Now, this is the other interesting point. This is why the crucial quality, that's why the crucial stages are to check on the guru's qualities. Now, if I hadn't done my due diligence and I just asked anybody to show me how to make a cake, that means I'd have no idea whether they knew what they were talking about. And this is our trouble. We will ask anybody for any advice anywhere, and we've never checked if they're valid. So we have 47 people vomiting their ideas down our throat. We look online and we believe everything we've read. We've got no discernment, no wisdom. So our minds are full of confusion. No wonder. But my mother, I checked on her. Now, the thing is, why should I check on her? Because I didn't know how to make a cake. She could have said to me, put 17 eggs in. I would not know whether that was true because I had no experience. So the only way to be confident is first to check on her reputation and her qualities. And on the basis of that, have confidence and then request and shut up and listen and then put it into practice myself. That's a transmission. That's an oral transmission. That even you could argue is an initiation. I mean, the principle is this, the principle. But of course, the whole other one is because these practices, it's just a question of degree, really. Some are much more complex and more advanced. And you can only do them when you have received that empowerment because your mind is not capable. Your mind has to be ripe, you know. But the principle is the same. That makes sense, doesn't it, Matthew? Wouldn't you agree?
Thank you so much.
Okay. Anybody else? Questions? 20 past already. 10 minutes to go for our first session. No other questions, people? Well, never mind. Let me just do a little visualization then, straight from Lama's book. I'll just get one of the first meditations. I'll just keep it very simple. Where are we? All the way through the book, he's got very many different variations of meditations. 61, we'll try this one. We'll just do a little meditation, okay? 61. Okay. Well, this is chapter 5, visualizing the guru as Chenrezig. So the next part is concerning the visualization of the guru, the spiritual master. The Tibetan, okay, the subjects, okay, we would spend months. Okay, day joy. Okay, you can say that in a visualization, blah, blah, blah. All right. Where is it? Oh, he's just talking about it in general. It's not a visualization here. But why don't we do that? We'll keep it simple. We'll keep a really simple one. So we'll visualize, if you have a spiritual teacher, and if you don't have, then maybe if you like the idea of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, you think he's a good example, then you can visualize him. But if you do have a spiritual teacher, male or female, doesn't matter, But I think you usually visualize them in the form. So if they're a lay person, you'd visualize them as a lay person. If they're ordained, you'd visualize them as ordained. So just try and imagine an idealized version of your spiritual teacher, female or male, in the mess. And if they're a lay person, try to imagine them in the most beautiful. I mean, maybe it's too complicated for your mind. Maybe it's easier just to visualize a monk or a nun. But if your teacher's not that, but if they are, you visualize in front of you your teacher. You imagine in this perfect form, and they're looking like Gelugpa style. So they're dressed in the robes, sitting cross-legged on a throne. A throne is usually given to a living person, like Shakyamuni Buddha, you visualize him on a throne. These deities, these other Buddhas, you visualize on a lotus. So you visualize him on a throne. It's a high kind of structure, square structure, and it's held up by snow lions. It's all very ancient and wonderful, very beautiful. And you visualize them made of light, so beautiful, so radiant, sweetest face, the actual person's face. And if they're a monk or a nun, you visualize they've got the yellow pointy hat on. And they're holding, there's a picture here of His Holiness doing like this. They've got the aspect of Chenrezig. Let me just do your best. Okay, you visualize, do your best. I'm just looking. So he's sitting cross-legged, she's sitting cross-legged. In the left hand is a Dharma wheel, like just a round thing. In the left hand, in the meditation mudra in the lap. And the right hand is at the heart, in the mudra of the 3 jewels. And then holding between the thumb and the ring finger, a lotus blooming at the right ear, and in that lotus is a text, and a sword, which represents, I don't know, never mind what it represents. And he's sitting on a beautiful throne, and there are lots of offerings around. So just do your best, use your creative imagination. Totally made of light, radiant, beautiful, perfect. And then you're thinking that their mind is the mind of Chenrezig. And they're manifesting in this human body to show you how you can become Chenrezig. They are the manifestation in human form of Chenrezig. Just try to imagine that. Beautiful, radiant, everything's perfect, radiant, light, nothing substantial. You imagine this. And infinite love and compassion. They only want to benefit you. That's their job in your life. You've chosen this person. So their job, you've given them permission to show you your mind, to show you your delusions and your virtues. So here particularly, we think that they're showing us my potential. They're the mirror image of my potential. They're the manifestation of this infinite love, infinite wisdom, infinite compassion. And they're showing me that I too can become like this. I too have these qualities, have this potential. So it should lift your heart, you know. So here are the qualities: infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, infinite love. Wants only for you to be happy. Imagine this, completely the embodiment of these qualities. Their mind is the mind of Chenrezig, and their form is the form that you can see, the form of your teacher. If they're monk or nun, showing in this perfect robes with their little pointy yellow hat on, which shows their Tsongkhapa. Everything's radiantly beautiful. And their whole job, because ego's gone. If they're Buddha, their ego has gone. So their only job is to help you. The infinite compassion to want to help you, the infinite wisdom to know how, and the infinite ability to do it. Imagine this. So we just visualize. We just imagine now to finish our session. We just say the 4 immeasurable thoughts. We visualize from precious Lama Chenrezig. His Lama and the Chenrezig are the same. Same. And from his heart, you imagine his sense from Chenrezig at his heart, pouring out light, blessing us completely. First you do that. Imagine she pours out this light, Lama Chenrezig, from the heart, which is the heart of Chenrezig, pouring out beams of light that enter us, completely filling us, relieving all the pain and the anxiety and the fears, you know, the fears and the worries and the dramas that loom so large for us. completely annihilating them and filling us, calming our mind, calming us, filling us with this blissful radiant light, the energy of our Lama, the energy of Chenrezig. We won't do the 4 measures, we'll do that later. Just visualizing this and feeling full of this blissful energy, calming our worries, settling our mind down. Really feeling this, knowing it's possible to be just like the Lama, just like Chenrezig. Om Mani Padme Hum. 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 Full of this blissful energy of the Lama Chenrezig. And then we just think, we dedicate a little prayer here. I'll read it out from Lama. Maybe it's from the sadhana. So I dedicate fully my virtuous actions of all the 3 times so that I may receive continuous care from a Lama and attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all through accomplishing my prayers. The supreme deed of Samantabhadra is this famous person, never mind. So we think like that, and that's it, enough. We do now finish our session now, think about what we just talked about. And then for the next hour and a half, try and imagine that in your heart you're Chenrezig. Maybe you're not visualizing yourself as Chenrezig. Until you have empowerment, you don't do that. But you imagine your heart is a part of Chenrezig and Chenrezig is guiding you. Your Lama as Chenrezig is guiding you for this next 30 minutes or 90 minutes, an hour and a half, isn't it? No, how long?
We resume at 1:30 Mountain Time.
2 hours. Okay, see you in 2 hours, you folks. Thank you, precious ones. Unless you're in bed already. I don't know. We'll see you. Okay, darlings, bye. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you.